At my grandfather's estate reading, my brother grabbed the lawyer's arm before he even finished the sentence and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "She doesn't need to be here for this part." Everyone turned to look at me, my aunt, my cousins, my mother, who said nothing, my brother's fiancée, Courtney, who was inspecting her nails. I was 37 years old, and I had just driven 4 hours from Ottawa to sit in a lawyer's boardroom in London, Ontario, only to be told, not by the lawyer, but by my brother, that I didn't need to be there. I stayed in my seat. I folded my hands on the table, and I thought about the envelope in my bag. Let me back up. My grandfather, my mother's father, built his life the slow way. He came to Canada from Scotland in his 20s with not much more than a trade and a work ethic that embarrassed everyone around him. He was a plumber who eventually owned 4 properties in southwestern Ontario, a modest investment portfolio, and a house in London that he'd paid off before I was born. He was not rich in the way people mean when they say the word carelessly. He was comfortable, deliberately, carefully comfortable. His name was Edmund. Everyone called him Ed. He smelled like pipe tobacco even after he quit smoking, and he kept peppermints in his shirt pocket. And he was the only person in my family who ever asked me what I actually thought about things. My brother's name is Scott. He's 4 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, he has been the one my family fussed over. Not because he was smarter or kinder, because he was the firstborn son, and in our family, that meant something that was never said out loud, but was communicated in 1,000 small ways across 30 years. Scott got the car for his 18th birthday. I got a card with a gas station gift card tucked inside. Scott got help with his down payment. I got advice to start saving. Scott got invited to every financial conversation my grandfather had with my mother. I found out about those conversations when Grandpa Ed mentioned them casually, once, not realizing I hadn't been included. I don't say this to paint myself as a victim. I had a life. I have a good job. I work in project management for a construction firm. I have a small house I bought myself, a dog named Barley, friends I've had since university, a life that belongs to me. But there is a particular kind of loneliness in being the person in your family who everyone assumes is fine without ever asking. Grandpa Ed asked. That made him different. When he got sick, really sick, the kind of sick that doesn't unsick, I started driving to London more often. Every 2 or 3 weeks, I'd bring groceries, sit with him, watch the hockey game, argue about whether the Leafs would ever figure themselves out. Sometimes we'd just sit quietly. He was losing weight and he knew it, and we didn't talk about that directly, but we talked about everything else. Scott came at Christmas and on his birthday. Once in March when I called him and told him things were getting worse. Courtney came with Scott sometimes. She was warm in the way that people who have studied warmth are warm. She remembered details about everyone, the names of your kids, what you ordered last time at a restaurant, but it always felt like data retrieval rather than actual interest. She was 31, worked in real estate marketing, and she laughed at everything my grandfather said even when it wasn't funny. I noticed her sitting close to him. I noticed her touching his arm. I noticed how she started referring to his house as this beautiful place and asking about the garden and whether he'd ever thought about what he'd do with the piano in the living room. I didn't say anything. I thought I was being uncharitable. I was not being uncharitable. Grandpa Ed died in January. It was a Tuesday, and it was gray outside, and I had been there the week before. We had eaten tomato soup and watched the news, and he had fallen asleep in his chair, and I had turned the TV down and covered him with the blanket from the back of the couch. I kissed him on the forehead when I left. I don't know if I knew it was the last time. I think maybe I did. The call came from my mother. She cried on the phone. I cried in my car in the parking lot of a Canadian Tire. I drove home and sat with Barley on the kitchen floor for a long time. The will reading was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Standard timeline, the lawyer's office said. There were some complications to sort through. I didn't know what complications meant yet. My mother told me, in a conversation that felt slightly rehearsed, that Grandpa Ed had updated his will about 8 months before he died. The house would go to Scott. The investment portfolio would be split between Scott and a charitable gift to the hospital where Grandpa Ed had received his treatment. My share, a small amount he'd originally designated for me, had been redirected, My mother said this like she was reading from notes. She said Grandpa Ed had made his wishes very clear. She said Scott had been very involved in helping Grandpa Ed get his affairs in order in the final year. I asked her why no one had told me any of this while it was happening. She said she hadn't wanted to cause drama. That night I opened a bottle of Shiraz and sat at my kitchen table and thought about all the times in the last year I had driven to London, all the soup, all the hockey games, all the quiet Tuesday evenings that I had genuinely wanted to be there for, that I had never thought of as transactions, that had never been about anything except the fact that I loved him. And then I thought about the voicemail. About 4 months before Grandpa Ed died, my upstairs neighbor knocked on my door on a Sunday afternoon. She's in her 70s, retired, sharp as a blade. She'd been using a new phone her daughter had set up for her, and she'd accidentally voice messaged me instead of her daughter. The message was 9 minutes long. She was mortified. She came downstairs to apologize in person before I'd even listened to it. I listened to it that evening because I was going to delete it and wanted to make sure there was nothing important in it first. Most of it was a conversation with her daughter. Standard stuff, the weather, a doctor's appointment, whether to sell the condo in Florida. But about 6 minutes in, her daughter mentioned something she'd heard from a mutual acquaintance. And then my neighbor said something that made me put down my glass. She said, "Did you know Edmund McAllister's granddaughter, the one who comes every weekend? Did you know they pushed her out of the will? The son and that girlfriend of his have been working on the old man for months. My friend Norma does admin at the lawyer's office. She said it's all perfectly legal, but it doesn't sit right." I sat very still. Then I listened to that part 3 more times. I didn't do anything with it immediately. I didn't know what to do with it. Doesn't sit right is not evidence of anything. My neighbor's friend Norma, doing admin at a lawyer's office, is not a source I could take anywhere. I put the voicemail in a folder on my phone and I thought about it for weeks. And then something happened that changed the shape of what I knew. Courtney had added me on Instagram about a year earlier. I'd accepted because refusing felt like a declaration of war, and I wasn't ready for that. I muted her, but I didn't unfollow her. 2 weeks after Grandpa Ed passed, she posted a photo. It was a picture of his living room, the piano, the window with the lace curtains he'd had since the 70s. She had added a small potted plant to the windowsill that hadn't been there before. She captioned it, "Starting to make this place our own. So grateful." He had been gone for 14 days. I screenshotted it. I don't know why, in that moment. I just did. Then I went to her profile and scrolled back, and I found something I hadn't noticed before because I had muted her and hadn't been paying attention. In October, 3 months before Grandpa Ed died, 5 months after the will was apparently changed, she had posted a photo from a restaurant. Her and Scott dressed up, champagne glasses. The caption said, "Celebrating good news. The future is bright." No other details. In September, there was a photo of her and Scott standing outside what I now recognized as the office of Graham and Associates, the firm that had handled Grandpa Ed's legal affairs for years. They were laughing. She had captioned it, "Life admin done right." Lawyers' offices are not where you go to celebrate. They're not where you document good news in September and drink champagne in October. I am not a paranoid person. I am a project manager. I understand timelines and documentation, and the way things that seem unrelated can be part of the same sequence when you lay them out in order. I laid them out in order. I called a lawyer, not Grandpa Ed's lawyer, a different one. I found an estates litigation firm in Ottawa, booked a consultation, paid the $300 fee, and sat across from a woman named, well, she doesn't need to be named here, who listened to everything I said and then asked me a series of very precise questions. She explained to me what undue influence means in the context of estate law. She explained that in Canada, a will can be challenged if there is evidence that the testator, the person making the will, was subject to pressure that overrode their own free will. She explained that this is difficult to prove and expensive to pursue and that most people don't win. She also said, "What you've described, isolation from decision-making, a pattern of involvement by one beneficiary during a period of declining health, a change made late in life, these are factors courts look at." I asked her what I would need. She gave me a list. I want to be honest about this part. I did not go looking for evidence in a calculating, strategic way. What happened is that once I knew what to look for, I couldn't stop seeing it. My cousin, my mother's sister's son, someone I've been close to my whole life, texted me a week after the funeral to ask how I was doing. We got to talking. I mentioned, carefully, that I was surprised by some of what had happened with the will. He went quiet for a moment and then said, I wasn't going to say anything, but there's something you should probably know. He told me that at my grandfather's 78th birthday dinner, a small family gathering at the house last spring, he had overheard a conversation between Scott and Courtney in the hallway. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but Courtney had said, clearly and without lowering her voice enough, he just needs to be reminded that she isn't around when it counts. Just keep saying it. Gently. That's all. My cousin hadn't known what to do with it. He said he'd told himself he'd misheard. He said he was sorry he hadn't said anything sooner. I asked if he'd be willing to write that down. He said yes. I also went back through my own phone. I had, over the last 2 years of visiting Grandpa Ed, occasionally texted my mother to let her know I was there. Things like, just arrived, Ed looks good today, or heading home, we had a nice visit. I had done this automatically as a courtesy. Without meaning to, I had created a time-stamped log of every visit. 41 visits in the last 2 years. I gave everything to my lawyer, the voicemail, the screenshots, my cousin's written account, my text logs. She said it was more than she expected. The will reading was on a Wednesday in March. The boardroom at Graham & Associates had a long table and a window that looked out onto a parking garage. My mother was there. Scott was there. Courtney was there, even though she wasn't family yet. She sat next to Scott and slightly behind him, like a consultant who had prepared him for this meeting. When I walked in, Scott looked surprised, and then he looked at Courtney, and she gave the smallest shake of her head. The lawyer, a measured man in his late 50s, welcomed everyone and began to go through the formalities. When he got to the section outlining the updated distribution, Scott leaned forward. He started talking about how Grandpa Ed had been clear about his intentions. He mentioned all the help he provided in the last year, the practical support, managing the property. Then he turned to me and said, she doesn't need to be here for this part. The room turned. I looked at him for a moment. He held my gaze with the steady confidence of someone who had already won. I reached into my bag and I placed a folder on the table. I said, actually, I think everyone here should hear this. The lawyer looked at the folder. He looked at me. He asked what it contained. I told him, briefly, evidence of a coordinated effort to influence my grandfather's decisions during a period of documented cognitive decline and social isolation from family members who were not Scott. The room changed in a way that is hard to describe. Not dramatically. Nobody stood up or raised their voice. It was quieter than that. It was the silence of a script running out of lines. My mother said my name. Scott said it was ridiculous. His voice had a tremor in it that he was working to control. Courtney said nothing. She had stopped looking at her hands. The law's said he needed to review the documents before proceeding and suggested we take a short break. The litigation took 7 months. I won't pretend it was simple or clean or without cost. It cost me money and sleep and a version of my family that I had maybe been holding on to without realizing it. My mother spoke to me in monosyllables for most of the spring. There were dinners I wasn't invited to. There was a group text I was removed from. My cousin showed up. He was there when it mattered, and I don't forget that. What the process found, documented through medical records and interviews with Grandpa Ed's care team, was a pattern that my lawyer described in her final brief as sustained and deliberate manipulation of a vulnerable adult during a period of documented cognitive decline. Grandpa Ed had been diagnosed with early vascular dementia 7 months before the will was changed. His GP had noted it. His specialist had noted it. Scott had attended several of those appointments. I know this because his name appears in the records as family member present. Nobody had told me about the diagnosis. My mother said she hadn't wanted to worry me. The updated will was set aside. The estate reverted to the previous version. I did not get everything. The previous version of the will still gave Scott the house. I got the investment portfolio, which was meaningful, not life-changing, but real. More than the money, what I got was the record, a formal legal finding that what had been done was wrong, that it had been deliberate. that I had not imagined it. Scott and Courtney did not get married. I found out from my cousin in a brief text that it had ended about a month after the litigation concluded. I did not ask for details and he didn't offer them. My mother called me in November. It was a Sunday early evening. She sounded tired in a way that I think had been a long time coming. She said she hadn't known everything, and I believe her, partially, in the way I believe most things that are probably true but not entirely. She said she was sorry she hadn't protected me better. She said she missed me. I said I missed her too. Because I did. Because you can be angry at someone and miss them at the same time, and anyone who tells you otherwise hasn't had to sort through the wreckage of a family that loved each other badly. We are still figuring it out. We talk on Sunday evenings now. Sometimes it is easy, and sometimes it is careful, and sometimes she says something that makes me have to breathe through a moment before responding. But we talk. I still have the photo on my phone, Courtney's Instagram post, Grandpa Ed's living room, her potted plant on the windowsill, starting to make this place our own. I don't look at it often, but I haven't deleted it. Bali is asleep at my feet right now. There are leftovers in the fridge. There is a drive to London in my near future. Not to a boardroom this time, but to visit my mother, who is in her mid-60s and going to her own doctor more often now, who left a voicemail last week that ended with "I love you," in a way that sounded like she meant it, and also like she was making up for something. I think about Grandpa Ed. I think about Tuesday evenings and tomato soup and the way he'd say, "Well, let's see about that," whenever I was being too hard on myself. I think about how he asked me what I actually thought about things and how rare that was and how I didn't fully appreciate it until it was gone. He deserved better than what happened to him. I know that. I can hold that knowing without letting it hollow me out. Some things you fight for not because you'll win everything back, but because staying quiet would mean agreeing that it was fine. It was not fine. I had 41 text messages and a cousin who showed up and a voicemail from a neighbor who meant to call her daughter, and I used every single one of them. That felt like enough. Some days it even feels like more. I keep coming back to something Grandpa Ed used to say when I was being too hard on myself. Well, let's see about that. Not dismissive, not cheerful in a fake way. Just patient. Like he genuinely believed that most things, looked at long enough and honestly enough, would reveal what they actually were. I think about that a lot now. About what it means to look at something honestly. What Scott and Courtney did wasn't complicated when you strip it back. They found someone they loved who was aging and frightened and slowly losing his grip on things, and they moved into that space deliberately. They knew what they were doing. That's the part that stayed with me longest. Not the betrayal itself, but the calculation behind it. The fact that Courtney could stand in a hallway at a birthday dinner and say, "Just keep saying it, gently," like she was coaching a sales call. There's a word for the opposite of that, and it isn't a complicated word. It's just decency. The willingness to treat someone, especially someone vulnerable, as a person whose choices matter, whose dignity matters, rather than as a problem to be managed toward a useful outcome. Scott had watched Grandpa Ed his whole life. He knew who he was, and he chose anyway. I don't think I'm better than my brother. I think I made different choices, and I think those choices came from actually paying attention. 41 visits. Not because I was building a case. Because I wanted to be there. But here's the thing about paying attention. It makes you useful when it counts. I had timestamps on my phone because I'd been texting my mother out of courtesy. I had a voicemail because my neighbor meant to call her daughter. I had my cousin's account because he trusted me enough to tell the truth when I asked. None of it came from strategy. It came from having lived honestly enough that the evidence of my honesty was already there, sitting in my phone, waiting. That's the part I want to hold on to, not the outcome, though the outcome mattered, but the fact that doing the right thing quietly, without an audience, without recognition, still leaves a trail. It accumulates. It becomes something you can point to. And when someone tries to rewrite the story of who you are and who showed up and who cared, you don't have to argue, you just have to open the folder. The hard part was the aftermath. The months of careful conversations with my mother. The group text I wasn't in. The version of my family I had to let go of in order to reach the one that was actually real. That takes something different than just being right. It takes the willingness to stay in it, when staying is uncomfortable, to keep showing up for people even when they've hurt you, to hold the line without turning cold. I'm still working on that part. I won't pretend I always get it right. But I think about Grandpa Ed. I think about the fact that he asked me what I actually thought about things. He didn't do that because I was easy or convenient. He did it because he was genuinely interested. He modeled something for me without ever naming it, the idea that the people worth your time are the ones you're actually curious about. That clarity of attention is its own form of integrity. He deserved someone who fought for him. I'm glad it was me.